January 31, 1945. Clark Air Base, Luzon, Philippines. Major Frank T. McCoy steadied his camera as he approached the mysterious aircraft resting before him. Bathed in Philippine sunlight, the machine revealed itself to be a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, tail number 76312, improbably intact and waiting like a ghost of Japan's air power. No professional Air Force, McCoy thought, would design a bomber in such a way. Something about this airplane defied logic. Its long, sleek fuselage glistened, perfectly matching the Allied nickname that mocked its cigar-shaped profile. Nearly 20 meters from nose to tail, the aircraft balanced confidently on its tricycle landing gear, as if expecting to take off again with only a few turns of the propellers. The wings stretched more than 25 meters tip to tip, remarkably free of bullet scars or burn marks. The twin 14-cylinder radials looked pristine, each capable of delivering roughly 1,500 horsepower. This was no salvaged wreck dragged from a crash site. It was a fully capable combat asset, abandoned only by circumstance. Yet, none of that explained what McCoy found inside. Crawling through an inspection hatch into the wing structure, he froze. The Betty's fuel system, the aircraft's beating heart, was entirely unprotected. Bare aluminum tanks sat exposed, waiting for disaster. No rubberized self-sealing layers, no armor plating, no fire suppression lines, nothing. Only thin metal skin and thousands of liters of volatile aviation fuel separated survival from instant inferno. McCoy commanded the Technical Air Intelligence Unit in the Southwest Pacific and had studied countless Japanese aircraft throughout the campaign. But this discovery was different. This bomber, complete, undefiled by wreckage or fire, finally told the full truth. Here was physical evidence of a design philosophy that placed performance above every other consideration, including the lives of its crew. The implications shook American analysts. Range, speed, payload. These had been purchased at a terrible price. Every expectation American pilots held about Japanese survivability was wrong. Every reassurance an Allied bomber crew depended upon, armor around fuel tanks, emergency systems to contain fires, had been stripped away here in pursuit of extreme reach. The shock of that realization carried McCoy back 4 years to the first moment the Betty had demonstrated its terrifying potential. December 8, 1941. As the smoke of Pearl Harbor still drifted over Oahu's waters, 82 G4M bombers lifted from bases in Formosa, heading straight for the American fortress at Clark Field in the Philippines. Flying high above American anti-aircraft range, they arrived at 12:35 p.m. with immaculate precision. 27 aircraft dropped more than 600 bombs across runways and fuel depots. A sweep of Zero fighters followed, ripping apart the few aircraft spared by the first strike. Of the 17 B-17 flying fortresses stationed there, 12 were destroyed instantly. Nearly every P-40 fighter was reduced to burning scrap in a matter of minutes. For the Americans below, powerless to intercept, unable to retaliate, the Betty appeared unstoppable. As Lieutenant James Harrington later recalled, perfect formation. Too high to reach, we couldn't get a single plane in the air. The Japanese departed untouched, leaving behind a smoking battlefield and an air force shattered on the ground. And this was only the beginning. The Betty's reach proved unmatched. Its first months of operation carved a trail across the Pacific, from Formosa to the Philippines, from Indochina to Malaya, from Rabaul to Darwin. It struck where no bomber should have been able to reach, operating from bases the Allies believed safely out of range. Every early victory reinforced the assumption at the heart of its design. It would not need protection because no one could catch it, but dominance built on outrunning resistance could never last. By the middle of 1942, the sky over the Pacific had changed. American fighter strength grew, Wildcat squadrons gave way to Hellcats and Corsairs, and tactical doctrine evolved with every engagement. The same aircraft that once struck with impunity now faced interceptors capable of reaching altitude and speed faster than Japanese planners ever expected. Reports from Betty crews grew increasingly grim. Missions that once ended in celebration now returned with staggering losses, or did not return at all. American pilots quickly learned the aircraft's greatest weakness: hit the wings, ignite the fuel, and the bomber simply ceased to exist. It earned savage nicknames across Allied squadrons: one-shot lighter, flying Zippo, references to the way tracers transformed the plane into a fireball within seconds. Guadalcanal proved the turning point. On August 8, 1942, 23, G4M bombers departed Repulse intent on striking the newly established U.S. foothold. They were intercepted over Savo Island by waiting fighters. 18 were shot down. Nearly 120 airmen never made it back. American pilots emerged from the fight stunned at how quickly the Bettys disintegrated once hit. Lieutenant Commander John Thomas Blackburn of VF-17 summed up the shift bluntly. "First time we caught a Betty formation, we couldn't believe how fast they turned into flame." The truth behind that phenomenon, the terrifying fragility built into the aircraft's very bones, would only be fully understood once intact Bettys finally fell into Allied hands. That chance arrived late in 1942, when Australian troops captured Japanese positions at Buna. Abandoned aircraft scattered across the airfield provided the first clear view inside Japan's most feared bomber. Engineers from the Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit inspected the recovered machines. What they found confirmed every pilot's observation. The wing tanks, major reservoirs of explosive aviation fuel, were built from nothing more than thin aluminum plate. Not a single layer of self-sealing rubber. No compartmentalization. No armor. A single bullet could turn the aircraft into a funeral pyre. American technicians ran the numbers and the conclusion was undeniable. Japan had exchanged survivability for range. More discoveries followed in early 1945 when the perfectly preserved Betty at Clark Airfield was dismantled piece by piece. Analysts documented every cable, every bulkhead, every structural compromise that allowed the bomber to fly farther than any counterpart in the world, but also ensured that any encounter with enemy fire would be fatal. The specifications told the entire story more clearly than testimony ever could. A massive fuel load spread through large unprotected cells, minimal armor, no redundancy in critical systems, ultralight structure prioritized above all else. It was engineering brilliance, focused in a single direction, and catastrophically blind to another. The bomber's extraordinary reach was not a fortunate accident. It was the direct result of a set of requirements issued in 1937 by the Imperial Japanese Navy, specifications that would shape not only this aircraft, but Japan's entire approach to aerial warfare. The Navy demanded a land-based strike aircraft capable of flying thousands of kilometers across open ocean, supporting fleet operations far from home islands. No bomber anywhere in the world, not even America's early B-17s, could hope to match that ambition in 1937. Vast distances defined Japan's strategic problem. Formosa to the Philippines, 460 miles Rabaul to Guadalcanal, 600 miles Tokyo to potential U.S. outposts, far beyond existing capabilities. If Japan wished to dominate the Pacific, it needed a bomber that could reach any target, even if no escort could follow. Mitsubishi engineer Kiro Honjo accepted the challenge. A disciple of German design philosophies he had studied at Junkers, he knew from the beginning that fulfilling the Navy's demands meant a ruthless mathematics. Every kilogram of armor or protection meant a kilogram less fuel, which meant fewer miles flown, which meant mission failure. And mission failure was not an option. Protection was therefore the first item sacrificed. Fuel capacity, not crew safety, became the defining principle. The wings became flying fuel tanks. The fuselage, a thin metal shell wrapped around volatility. Fire suppression systems, extra weight, armor, heavy and therefore unacceptable. Self-sealing tanks, a luxury Japan could not afford if it wanted range unmatched on Earth. The first prototype flew in October 1939 and proved the Navy's gamble correct, at least for the moment. The bomber was fast, carried a meaningful payload, and possessed range that seemed impossible. It entered service as the Type 1 land-based attack bomber, soon known worldwide as the G4M Betty. Its debut in the opening months of 1942 made it appear unstoppable. When operating unopposed, beyond the reach of Allied fighters, when the Betty was devastating, it sank battleships, obliterated airfields, and delivered reconnaissance intelligence across the Pacific at distances other nations could barely imagine. But the Betty's strength depended entirely on an assumption that would not survive first. Contact with Allied production. Enemy fighters would remain scarce and short-legged forever. Once American industrial might surged into the Pacific and the balance shifted, the logic underpinning the Betty's existence collapsed. Every mile of Additional range was paid for with the lives of the men who flew it. Every design compromise that had enabled its early triumphs now guaranteed that almost any combat damage would result in an airborne funeral. By late 1942 and into 1943, Guadalcanal turned that cruel arithmetic into undeniable truth. The bomber, that once symbolized Japan's ability to strike anywhere, became a symbol of its inability to protect the air crews who made those strikes possible. Loss rates soared beyond anything Japan could replace. Veteran crews, irreplaceable assets, were consumed in flames, characteristic of their own aircraft's design. The very feature that had made the bomber Japan's long-arm sword was now the weakness that shattered that sword mid-swing. Even when Japanese engineers recognized the scale of the disaster unfolding in the skies, the problem was nearly impossible to correct. In March 1943, beginning with the 663rd production airframe, Mitsubishi attempted a compromise. Sheets of D-30mm rubber installed beneath the wing skin around fuel tanks. The idea was not true self-sealing protection, merely a delay in leakage, but even this modest improvement cost performance. Top speed fell and range dropped by more than 300 kilometers. Worse, combat results showed almost no improvement in survival. Small caliber bullets might slow a leak, but incendiary rounds, cannon shells, or tracer hits still ignited the vapor-rich interior. Any fire remained fatal. The aircraft's core vulnerability, its structural dependence on exposed fuel, remained unchanged. A more radical solution arrived far too late. The G4M3 model, finally equipped with genuine self-sealing tanks, began production in October 1944. The modification slashed fuel capacity, and thus range, by over 2,000 kilometers. Only a few dozen reached combat before Japan's defeat. By that time, American fighters dominated every front. No level of added protection could save an aircraft that now had nowhere left to hide. The Betty's grim reputation was cemented not only through American accounts but through the fate of Japan's most respected naval commander. On April 18, 1943, the death of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the aircraft's fatal design flaw became world-known. U.S. codebreakers intercepted Yamamoto's travel itinerary, a flight from Rabaul to Bougainville aboard a G4M with fighter escort. 16 P-38 Lightnings launched from Guadalcanal, flying hundreds of miles over open ocean at wave-top height to avoid radar. Their navigation had to be perfect. There was no second chance. At 09:34 a.m., right on schedule, they spotted the formation. 2 Betty bombers, 6 Zero escorts. The Americans split, fighters tangled, and Rex Barber lined up on the lead bomber, Yamamoto's plane. A few bursts into the wing route. Flames erupted instantly. The Betty crashed into the jungle, taking Japan's most influential strategist with it. The second bomber met the same fate. Not one G4M survived. Yamamoto's death demonstrated 3 realities: American intelligence superiority, American tactical precision, and the Betty's inability to survive even a brief engagement. 2 years later, that vulnerability became even more grotesque in its consequences. On March 21, 1945, 18 G4M bombers took off from Kanoya Air Base, each carrying a rocket-powered MXY-7 Oka beneath its belly, a manned suicide weapon with a massive 200-kiloless warhead. The mission plan required the Bettys to approach within 20 kilometers of U.S. naval forces before releasing the Okas. But carrying the Oka made them slow and doomed. American Hellcats intercepted first, long before release range. One after another, the bombers ignited into flaming wreckage, plunging into the sea. None survived, none released their weapons. The kamikaze pilots died still strapped inside their deadly gliders, never given the chance to complete their suicidal purpose. Bomber crew and 15 Oka pilots lost in one mission, a massacre made inevitable the moment they strapped into a G4M. The aircraft that delivered Japan's early war victories had become a coffin with wings. The lessons of the G4M were brutally clear to the Allies. Every aircraft that fell into their hands, from untouched wrecks to abandoned airfields, told the same story. The Japanese had prioritized range and speed above all else, leaving their crews extraordinarily vulnerable. The Betty's elegant lines and powerful engines could not disguise a fundamental flaw. Fire and destruction lurked behind every fuselage panel. Across the Pacific, pilots began to treat each engagement with a mixture of awe and dread. Intercepting a Betty was no longer a simple kill. It became a calculated risk. The bomber could still carry devastating payloads across unimaginable distances, but the likelihood of returning home safely plummeted with every hit. Survivors described the experience as watching a coffin float through the sky. This design philosophy reflected the Japanese military mindset of the time, courage and sacrifice elevated above technological pragmatism. The Imperial Navy demanded long-range strike capability. Engineers delivered, ignoring conventional safety standards. The results were spectacular in early campaigns, disastrous as the Allies adapted and gained air superiority. Even training manuals revealed a sobering reality. Crews were taught to avoid combat where possible, to rely on speed and formation discipline for survival. There were no armored sections, no redundant fuel lines, no fail-safes beyond the hope of outrunning the enemy. Every mission carried the implicit understanding, you might not come back. As the war progressed, these truths became unavoidable. By 1944, Japanese crews openly feared the Betty more than enemy fire. Its appearance on the horizon brought both hope for mission success and a deep awareness of personal peril. Flight logs documented rapidly increasing casualty rates, aircraft lost to tracer rounds, flak, and aggressive fighter interception. Operational statistics reflected a sobering truth. The bomber's triumphs had been purchased at an extraordinary human cost. Analysts in the Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit began mapping the correlations. Every G4M destroyed revealed the precise failure points engineers had ignored: wing tanks, control cables, fuselage thinness. The pattern was unmistakable. Where Allied bombers were designed with redundancy and survivability in mind, the Betty was a fragile instrument of reach and speed, stunning in design, but lethal in vulnerability. The paradox extended beyond technical aspects. Pilots who survived multiple missions were often physically and psychologically scarred. Many spoke of the sudden flare of tracer fire igniting wings in seconds, leaving no time to react. Even minor hits could cascade into catastrophic failures. Training and skill mattered little when faced with the inherent fragility embedded into the aircraft's structure. Despite these hazards, the Betty continued to fly across the Pacific, from Rabaul to Truk, from the Philippines to Iwo Jima. Its missions demonstrated strategic reach unmatched by any contemporary bomber. In some cases, the psychological effect alone justified deployment. Allied forces feared the bomber's speed and payload capacity, even knowing its vulnerabilities. The aircraft became a symbol of both Japanese ingenuity and hubris. In isolated victories, the Betty proved deadly. Strikes against lightly defended airfields, shipping convoys, and unescorted naval units yielded spectacular results. But these successes became increasingly rare as the Allies expanded fighter coverage and improved radar detection. The aircraft's era of dominance was slipping away, each loss compounding a grim statistical truth. Even toward the war's final months, crews attempted desperate innovations. Modified G4M3s carried auxiliary fuel tanks, light defensive armor, and experimental weaponry in the hopes of offsetting losses. Yet every modification came at a cost: reduced range, slower speeds, and increased exposure to enemy fighters. Engineers were trapped in a cruel trade-off. No longer could the aircraft deliver both safety and performance. By 1945, the G4M's vulnerabilities were painfully evident even to its own commanders. Operational losses mounted, and replacement aircraft could not keep pace with attrition. Veteran crews, the backbone of the bomber's early success, had been decimated. Pilots who survived repeated missions often carried deep psychological scars, haunted by the sudden and unavoidable flames that consumed their comrades in the air. The Japanese Navy, desperate to maintain offensive reach, turned increasingly to kamikaze operations. The Betty, stripped of armor and forced to carry the MXY-7 Oka, became a flying delivery system for human-guided bombs. The aircraft's inherent fragility now served as a perfect launch platform for suicide missions, a deadly combination of range, payload, and vulnerability. Every mission offered near certain death for the pilot, and all too often the crew. Meanwhile, Allied forces had grown adept at exploiting the aircraft's weaknesses. Radar tracking, long-range fighter sweeps, and concentrated firepower ensured that Betty formations were rarely left unchallenged. Combat reports repeatedly emphasized a terrifying truth. Once a shell penetrated the fuel tanks, the aircraft was essentially doomed. Speed and distance could no longer compensate for exposed vulnerability. The loss of Admiral Yamamoto earlier in the war remained a stark lesson. Even with escort fighters, a single successful interception could eliminate Japan's most critical personnel. Commanders increasingly understood that no amount of pilot skill could fully offset the structural flaws inherent to the G4M. Despite these limitations, the bomber's design continued to reflect Japan's strategic priorities. Every decision, thin fuselage, unprotected fuel tanks, minimal defensive armament, had been made to achieve maximum range and speed. Sacrifice of human life was an implicit acceptance, subordinated to the broader goal of extending reach across the Pacific. The juxtaposition of early triumphs against later devastation painted a striking narrative. In initial campaigns, the Betty enabled Japan to strike targets far beyond what any adversary expected, fostering fear and admiration. In later stages, the same design choices ensured catastrophic losses, eroding the very air power it once represented. Technical evaluations conducted by Allied intelligence provided further clarity. Each recovered G4M confirmed patterns identified by field observation: thin aluminum fuel tanks, minimal structural reinforcement, and the lack of redundancy in critical systems. Analytical diagrams and photographs circulated among engineers, illustrating the bomber's extreme fragility with chilling precision. These assessments also informed Allied tactical doctrine. Fighter pilots learned to target specific weak points: wing roots, engine nacelles, or exposed fuel tanks, with devastating effect. Bombers like the B-25, B-17, and carrier-based fighters could now approach the G4M with calculated confidence, reducing the effectiveness of previously untouchable formations. Despite its increasing obsolescence, the Betty continued to serve in desperate campaigns including transport, reconnaissance, and kamikaze operations. Its symbolic value, as both a fearsome instrument and a warning about design overreach, remained undeniable. By mid-1945, the G4M was little more than a relic of earlier Japanese air strategy. Its operational role had narrowed to desperate measures, supplying isolated garrisons, conducting reconnaissance over contested territories, and launching kamikaze missions. Each deployment underscored the cruel reality that the aircraft's once celebrated design, extreme range at minimal weight, now guaranteed peril for the crews who flew it. Training manuals had long emphasized avoidance of combat. Whenever possible, pilots were instructed to rely on formation discipline, speed, and evasive maneuvers to survive. Every flight brief carried an implicit warning. The aircraft's vulnerability was non-negotiable. Those who ignored it often paid with their lives. Even modifications introduced late in the war could not redeem the design. The G4M3 incorporated self-sealing fuel tanks, partial armor, and other minor reinforcements, but these came at the cost of range and speed, the very attributes that had made the aircraft strategically valuable. By then, Allied dominance in the air meant that range alone could not guarantee survival. The psychological burden on crews grew heavier with every mission. Flight logs and personal accounts document the constant tension, the expectation of sudden destruction. Pilots described seeing fellow Bettys ignited instantly by tracers, wings aflame, engines exploding, and realizing the same fate could strike them without warning. The combination of technical vulnerability and relentless Allied pressure created an environment of near-constant terror. Despite these grim realities, the Betty remained in service, performing what missions it could. Strikes against lightly defended targets, supply runs to distant outposts, and suicide attacks with the Oka all demonstrated the aircraft's remaining strategic utility. Its early design, prioritizing reach and payload over protection, ensured that it could still reach targets that no other Japanese bomber could. Yet every deployment highlighted the cost: human lives and morale, sacrificed for operational necessity. The aircraft's legacy is dual-faceted. On one hand, the G4M represents extraordinary engineering foresight, lightweight design, long-range capability, and sufficient payload to challenge Allied assets across the Pacific. On the other hand, it embodies a fatal miscalculation: the deliberate vulnerability of its crew in favor of operational performance. The juxtaposition of early successes and later catastrophic losses provides a sobering lesson in the limits of design priorities. Allied post-war analysis confirmed the full extent of the bomber's weaknesses. Every recovered airframe illustrated the same fatal design points: exposed aluminum fuel tanks, minimal armor, fragile fuselage, and lack of redundancy in critical systems. Engineers noted that even minor hits to the wings or fuselage could initiate catastrophic fire or structural failure. The Betty's performance had been remarkable only in the absence of competent opposition. Historical accounts also emphasize the human cost. The crews who manned the G4M, trained, skilled, and often courageous, faced overwhelming odds. Loss rates in many campaigns exceeded 50%, and entire squadrons were wiped out in single engagements. Casualty figures include both routine combat losses and the tragic results of kamikaze modifications, where the aircraft itself became a delivery system for certain death. The Betty's story is inseparable from the broader narrative of the Pacific War. Its rise illustrated Japan's initial tactical advantage, exploiting a combination of range, speed, and surprise. Its fall mirrored the increasing technological and tactical superiority of the Allies, as radar, long-range fighters, and improved gunnery exploited the aircraft's vulnerabilities. The life cycle of the G4M serves as a cautionary tale. Innovation, untempered by protection, can produce spectacular short-term results, but devastating long-term consequences. Even today, the G4M remains a subject of study for military historians and aviation engineers alike. Museums and recovered wrecks allow analysts to inspect every design detail, providing insight into both the ingenuity and the fatal compromises of wartime Japanese aircraft design. Its presence in historical accounts, combat reports, and pilot memoirs ensures that the lessons it embodies are remembered. In the end, the G4M Betty stands as a symbol of extremes. It reflects the relentless pursuit of operational advantage, the willingness to sacrifice human life for strategic goals, and the harsh realities of air combat in the Pacific theater. Its design, successes, and failures collectively tell the story of a machine that could reach farther than any contemporary aircraft, strike with deadly effect, yet remain perilously fragile in the face of determined opposition. Every surviving photograph, flight report, and intelligence assessment echoes the same lesson. Engineering brilliance alone does not guarantee victory. Without balance, without protection, without consideration for the lives entrusted to the machine, even the most extraordinary aircraft is ultimately doomed. The G4M's final missions, flown in the last desperate months of the war, serve as both testament and warning. As the Allies advanced on every front, Betty crews faced overwhelming opposition, dwindling resources, and the stark inevitability of failure. Yet the aircraft's operational footprint, stretching from Formosa to the Philippines to Rabaul and beyond, remains undeniable, a record of ambition, risk, and human sacrifice entwined in aluminum wings. And so, the story of the Mitsubishi G4M ends not in glory, but in a complex mixture of engineering triumph and tragic human cost. It teaches modern analysts, engineers, and historians alike that design choices, no matter how brilliant on paper, carry consequences that echo far beyond the drawing board. The Betty remains one of the most iconic, instructive, and cautionary aircraft in the history of aerial warfare.